Hi,
Hi, Steve.
Sydney.
How is it going?
Good, good. How are you doing?
I'm lovely. Yeah, just starting my day on this end of the ocean, of the
Yeah, so
Atlantic.
where are you actually?
Right now, I'm based just outside of Toronto.
Is that where you're from?
Yeah, it's where I was born. My family's from Jamaica, though.
Right, okay. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, terrific. So this is very nice to meet you. This is great. So t tell me about your work and
Yeah.
what you're doing. I'd really like to hear more about it.
Um, it's been such a beautiful journey because, I think my whole life I've been very called and directed towards there's like another way. I just always had this sense there's another way to be on this planet. And um, it was difficult because that wasn't often like affirmed outside of me, what I felt inside of me. And so I spent a few years, very necessary, critical years where I learned a lot in activist circles, really, really fighting for large scale systematic change. Um, and then
Was this was this in Toronto?
Yeah, this was in Toronto. This was in Kingston. This was from probably I was 15 years old. So when I was still here, when I went to university in Kingston. And then when I came back and I had graduated from my university at the very beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And that's when I had come back to Toronto.
Well, okay, so you went to university in Kingston.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay. That's really cool.
yeah. And during that time, like when I came back to the pandemic, it was like everything we thought we knew about the world, like was just falling apart.
Hmm.
And during that time, I was also really connecting with, um, ultimately with like, I was having experiences that I necessarily like, I couldn't explain, but they felt very true. And this process got me to really explore and understand, um, that while the systems of oppression, whether that is like white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, they exist and we have to face those external sources. I also started to begin to recognize how for generations we've been trained under these systems. And if these external systems were to sort of like disappear tomorrow, um, it wouldn't necessarily solve our problem. The grander root is the fact that we have training that has influenced our understanding of who it is that we are, who it is that we have to be in relationship with other human beings, with the earth, with plants and animals, and then on a larger scale with life itself. And it's this training that would plant the exact same seeds that would allow for those systems to be recreated over and over and over. And so recognizing that opened me up to exploring deeper, like what are the values, the beliefs, the identities, the relationships, most importantly, that we've inherited from these systems of domination. And how can this became the question that leads my life today, and is the foundation of the work that I'm now, trying to share with the world, is how can I undo this training and come to a deeper core, a deeper truth about who it is that we are. And from that point, connected to that, build whatever it is that wants to emerge from this falling apart, this
Mm,
necessary building process.
mm. So,
Yeah.
what were these? Could you say more about these experiences that you had and how they led you to this kind of shift in your perception of things?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing that comes up, it's funny because this actually happened way before the pandemic. This happened when I was a kid. I'll share that example and I'll share
Yes,
another.
good, good. Yeah.
Um, when I was around 8 years old,
Hmm.
um, my mom began to date a man who we learned later on was had very, very strong white supremacist beliefs.
Oh,
Um, and his training, he was trained under white supremacy to believe that his value came from having power over other people. And eventually that relationship led to my mom being financially dependent on him.
Wow.
Um, and that sort of created a breeding ground for abuse to take place, physical abuse, emotional abuse, mental, like so many different forms of abuse.
Mm.
Um, and it was interesting because experiencing the things I experienced at my house and then learning about movements for liberation and for justice that were just like historical in school. You know, I was learning about Rosa Parks and I was learning about Harriet Tubman and I was learning about Martin Luther King Jr. And I was like, it's so amazing to see the legal and the systematic changes that they were able to create. But, and this is, you know, realizing this at 10 was quite, I'm so grateful to have had that. But
Mm.
I was like, all of that is great, but none of that has changed the fact that this is happening within my home. And that sort of began to break open the understanding I live in today that it's a relational crisis. Like we, each and every single one of us, are the vessels in which what I call the consciousness of domination
Mm.
can move through.
Mm.
And so that was that one experience. And later on, during the pandemic, um, you know, I just began to have certain dreams that like really didn't make sense. I had experienced a trauma earlier in 2020 um, with an intimate loved one of mine and became very just like disconnected from that space of dreaming. And then it would be like moments where I would, for 3 nights in a row, for example, I would have this like I would go I'd sleep and I would just have this sense of like a deep loving presence. I didn't know anything about this presence. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it and it felt like I could just communicate everything that I wasn't addressing in, you know, the waking world.
Mm.
Um and then from that point it was just like, yeah, leaning into that and it was almost as if like this this veil lifted and I
Yeah.
could see things
Mhm.
clearly. Um, and I think that it can, you know, be very easy to have those experiences and to sort of like leave leave the body, leave this experience. But for me, what I was more curious is about how do I ground like this loving presence and what is it trying to teach me and how do I mm, yeah, how do I let this lead whatever, you know, whatever I'm being called into. So there was just a lot of synchronous events, but it
Was
was
this
really, it felt like
amazing? So was this happening during the pandemic then?
yes,
Okay,
yes.
so basically it was like just a few years ago,
Just a
essentially.
few years ago.
Yeah, that's when
Mm-hmm.
this started. Anyway, that sounds beautiful and very fascinating, you know. I mean, because, you know, in terms of like things like spiritual experiences, people often retreat in a way more when they have spiritual experiences. So what's really striking about your experiences was that it actually connected you more deeply to the world in some way, and in the sense of what needed to change. Because that's a beautiful combination, you know, and it's
Mm-hmm.
often doesn't happen that way because you usually have people who are involved in spiritual things and you have people involved in activism. But, you know, this is one of the things that we feel, you know, quite strongly about in Third Space is that we're trying to bring these things together because, you know, we feel like the change that needs to happen is a very deep one. You know, it's not a superficial, and it's not something that can be changed just by sort of moving the furniture around. You know, it's actually, you know, it's very deep, it's very existential kind of shift that needs to happen. So I'm very much connecting with what you're saying.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, that's exactly why I reached out to you as I was like listening to some of the stories and hearing about other people and the work that you do. I was like, yes, you know, like finally, because yeah, these spaces are rare and I hope my prayer is that they become, you know, less rare and more common, like people who are able to connect with what, you know, their own personal experience of this grand mystery that we're a part of and also look at the various ancient traditions and lineages that have stemmed from this exact same experience and come to that point of like embodiment. Because I think for me, what we're living through, the poly crisis, the meta crisis, it's a crisis of relationships, and it's also it's a spiritual crisis as well. And I think that's the grand question of our time, and work that like you guys do is seeking to open us to go deeper into that. Is like, how do we ground these deeper truths into reality in a way that's very practical? Um, yeah, yeah. So
Right.
there's lots of
So when you're saying a crisis of relationships, can you say more about that? Well, how do you see that?
yeah. I mean, on a large scale, I think, and with my own understanding of trauma, I think about how a lot of the relationships with human beings that we can name over the past 500 years, but I now, I used to say like, this all began with colonization, but it's so much deeper than that. Like, I think that humans have just been evolving. We've been evolving, since we've come onto this earth where life evolves, life changes. Um, but there's always sort of been this sort of root of like control over. And I think a lot of that comes from a lot of fear. But anyways, through my own self-study of my training under systems of domination has impacted about what I believe about myself and other people, I realized, oh, not only has this training created like fragmentation within myself, and deep sense of disbelonging, but it's also done that relationally. Like, you can just think as simply as, what's unfolding in the United States of America. This is not an issue of today. This is an issue grounded in the very origins of the country. The relational disconnect of arriving to a place, um, and disconnecting the original inhabitants from the land. And not only that, but also severing ancient relationships, whether that's with the animals and the plants that existed there, disconnecting, enslaved Africans from Africa, from their cultural lineages, from their cultural memories, and creating this new narrative. There's just so much rupture. And in trauma, there's a lot of talk about trauma causes rupture, and healing is the process of repair. And so I saw that within myself. I saw it, as a student of history, just historically, relationally, between men and women, between so many different people. And we see that most deeply now with the earth. We we originate from the earth. We are life, we are nature. And over time, the way in which we have evolved has allowed us to build structures, has allowed us to build ways of living, has allowed us to build ways that have disconnected us from that truth. And that's, I think, why we see ourselves in this ecological crisis today. There's a crisis now between our relationship that's so different from our origins, what allowed us to evolve, what allowed us to sustain ourselves, and to get to this point. And so, yeah, it's really just looking at, we're in inherent relationship. It honors also just that spiritual truth of oneness.
Hmm.
We're all related, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether it's conscious or not. And it seems like now all of our relationships, whether that's with ourselves, with other people, or with the earth, is now really rooted in exploitation, in obligation, in separation, in a sense of being better than. And those are the things that are rupturing and keep rupturing our relationships. And so when we look at this crisis from a relational standpoint that honors the truth that we are one, we then have a deeper responsibility to understand, okay, what does repair look like? What does healing look like? And a lot of that starts from within. A lot of that starts with healing and understanding the way in which our training, and our attachment to that training to make sense of the world, to find our place and our belonging, has ruptured the truth within us, repairing that, and from that point, embodying a different way of being with each other, with other humans, and with the earth. And so for me, that's what I can say about the relational crisis.
Beautiful,
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah.
Um, yeah, it's a. I think that was very well put. And the relational crisis, it's really interesting because it obviously has very deep roots, right? Um, and there is a way that we have developed, particularly in the Western world, in the modern Western world, we've developed, this all goes back to, the triumph of science, and so forth. Um, Along with that, there've been, I mean, particularly as you were saying, this relationship to the earth
Mhm.
is quite fundamental in that way. How we've seen the earth as a source of extraction for
Yeah,
us. For us, something for us. It's like not something separate and also something that's sort of there for us.
yeah,
But we don't have that kind of reciprocal relationship to the earth, which is a natural, if you feel yourself to be naturally part of the earth, which a lot of more, you know, um, older civilizations, let's say, many of them did have that understanding of where they were embedded in the natural world. They didn't see themselves as separate from the natural world. Um, we've really obviously gone in a very different direction, which has, produced some extraordinary things, but it has also produced some majorly big problems. And I also think about also the whole kind of patriarchal structures of our world and how because I do think, obviously I'm speaking in generalizations, but I do feel women actually have much more of um, uh, let's say, a natural ability to connect, to be in relationship. And this is something that's never been given it because it's been such a patriarchally dominated world. It's not been given any kind of significance, right? So this is another thing that I think is all part of these very deep structures that exist and that go back, a long way. It's also, tied up with Christianity. There's so many things that have led to these kind of structures where we now have, countries, communities where people feel very isolated. They feel the lack of agency. They don't feel connected. And we've built that world. We've built it. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm completely aligned with what you're talking about and feel very much, particularly now because, things are getting so extreme that, both on the side of, what's happening in the political world, but also what's happening with the earth. I mean, and the degree to which we are as a civilization so disconnected from the reality of it still, in spite of the fact that this has been, this is actually, a question of survival at this point. So these are huge and very fundamental issues, aren't they? I mean, absolutely uh, critical and fundamental.
absolutely. And I appreciate your mentioning of the role of, yeah, like patriarchy within this worldview, because I think that's also a massive form of training that we're all trying to navigate within like the very like physical um space, but then also I think energetically when we think of the wholeness, the balance that we all hold within us of masculine and feminine ways of being and also ways of knowing. Sometimes, I mean, part of also the hyper um, disconnected manifestation of masculinity, which we see within patriarchal, expressions of societies, ways of relating. Part of that has distanced and suppressed the great, like the parts of us that are connected to the unseen, the parts of us that have different ways of knowing, different ways of relating. And I feel like, yeah, I don't know where I'm going there, but just hearing you say that reminded me of that sense of, um, yeah, that sense of, yeah, how do we reconnect? And I think that in general, when we think about, the earth often referred to as mother across different cultures, a deep representation of feminine principles, um, that sort of like, yeah, there's a question of how can we allow Earth and how can we allow the feminine within us all to thrive and flourish from that point and bring balance. Because right now it's like, oof, super topsy-turvy.
Mm.
And so I guess the question is around that. I wanted to say that, but then also um, I'm thinking a lot about capacity building because, anyone who can and has the capacity to feel like the immense pressure of this time, it can be a lot to hold on one's own. And again, when we see things in isolation, it could feel like, how are we going to deal with all of these issues all at once? And I think that that's sort of where I've been finding peace is sort of seeing the interrelate, like the ways in which what's happening, politically within the US is deeply connected to what's unfolding, within Sudan or what's happening. Like it's just like it's addressing all of that together and building our capacity individually and collectively um, to hold this moment, to see the truth of this moment, to see the real suffering, to not deny it, um, will really assist us in stepping forward in deciding how we want to courageously act, how we want to courageously change in order to meet this moment with love. That love that's really grounded in courageous action. And so I just wanted to mention that a lot of it is about building capacity because it's a lot and it doesn't serve us to pretend like it's not.
Exactly. And so could you say some more about how you're thinking about doing that? How are you thinking about building capacity? What ways? How do you plan to go about this?
That's a big question. I'm going to sit with that because in some ways it's such a normal part of my day that it can sometimes feel like, what is it I specifically do? Um, hmm. One, I think building a practice of presence um, is a big thing. Building my capacity to be present within my body during this time, building my capacity to be present with whatever emotions arrive. Like if I'm feeling grief or despair about what's happening, just being able to like, okay, I'm going to pause and I'm going to feel this. I'm not going to judge this. I'm going to allow this to be. And then I'm going to trust that this is trying to communicate something that's very important for me. So I think a lot of that is that. And also, interestingly enough, so much of my sense of peace and my sense of capacity that I move in this world, it comes from being in a relationship with the earth. It comes from sitting with the earth, listening to the earth, spending that intentional time to understand the larger perspective of what's unfolding right now.
Mm.
And I think too, when we see cycles all the time in nature of death and rebirth, of destruction for creation, and I think witnessing that, I'm like, and this can be a very radical thing to say, but I'm going to say it. For me, this moment in time, we don't have to judge it as a mistake in the sense that this can be a very critical cycle of regeneration.
Mm.
And maybe we need the intensity of this time in order to access the level of regeneration that we're heading into. And I know it's so complex.
Mm.
That's not to give justification for any of the horrors that we're seeing, but it's also understanding it's one that's really grounded in reality. This is happening. And
Mm.
my point of power is being connected to the earth, listening to her wisdom, trusting what I see, and not seeing myself as separate from that, not seeing humanity as separate from that, and trusting that we need to fall through this destruction in order to access something deeper, regenerative, something cyclical.
Mm.
And so I think connection with the earth has helped my capacity. Um, and another thing too is doing what I can where I am with what I have in order to make decisions that are in alignment with what is true in my heart. And I think that that becomes easier when we begin to distance ourselves from the training that we've inherited from systems of domination, including, for example, one of the biggest trainings that we receive in the West and from capitalism and everything is that there's one right way.
Mm.
There's one right way to live. There's one right way to walk. There's one right path, and it's very linear. It's like in order to get here, you take this step, this step, this step, um, and that what I've learned in my own life is like that's just not true. Diversity is a natural component of life. It's actually a very critical component of life. And we see that, when we're in relationship with life as it is. And so I think a lot of that has come with connecting, okay, the pathways I've been told are necessary for success that I don't even want. When I let that go, what is true for me? What feels important to me? Can I lead my life from that point and taking like little steps every day, whether that's switching from using products that harm the earth to like creating your own products or, to something more extreme. Like for myself, I am detaching myself from all systems of exploitation, including capitalism, by not working formal jobs, but instead being connected to life and creating for life, creating for the continuance of life. There are so many different ways that I think we can connect with what is true. And I think when we feel empowered standing in truth, our capacity expands. And when our capacity expands, we can help and support folks who might have a limited capacity right now. And that will allow their capacity expand. And then, it ripples.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that strikes me about what you're saying is you see, for you to step out, because you're stepping out of, if you like, the structure.
Mhm.
You're saying, look, I'm not, I want, I feel I'm being called to step out. Um, that in itself is that's a big thing, that also not just doesn't just affect your consciousness, it affects the consciousness of everybody else. Just the fact that you're doing that and you're saying it is actually possible to do this is I think is very important because just for the reasons you said that we have been trained to believe that there's just one way to live, right? And we have to conform, right? Essentially. And if we don't conform, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
So this kind of message is kind of like what we are receiving from the societies we live in right now. So when I was a young person, I felt very similarly. I felt called to step out in that kind of way. And I spent a lot of time in the East as a result of that, which, opened up a huge amount of doors, in terms of some of the things you're speaking about. Um, and I think that this is one of the things that's very important for young people is to um, find the courage to at least try that, to experience, a different form of life, not to feel they have to conform, but to experiment, to see what's possible in stepping out in whatever way they might choose to do that. Because I think that we need as a culture desperately people that are standing on their own feet, that are thinking deeply about things for themselves, um, because one of the things we really lack at the moment is leadership, leadership which isn't based on ego, you know, on sort of ambition or whatever, but is based on care, on care for what we're all part of, right? For life itself, if you like. So I think where does that start? I feel in many ways that process starts with individuals being willing to do exactly what you're talking about, which is to step out and take the risk, of doing that, because it's not an easy thing to do, especially in the world we're living in right now, where, you know, um, uh, people are finding it hard to get jobs, to make a living, to, like how we need examples of people that are finding a way to do that. And that's going to bring a lot of inspiration to people to feel like, oh, maybe I could do that in some way, can find my own way to doing that. So I think that's like something about that feels to me like really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel that right now, I think if most people listen to their bodies are screaming, this is not right. This is something feels off. And I think that what is amazing is about what has given me the courage to step up and stand out, stand apart, but not stand alone, is witnessing that, is witnessing people who are living examples that there's another way to live, to love, to be, to relate on this earth. And so, for in some ways, I mean, that's also what gives me the courage to share my own stories and my own experiences, is because seeing that changed my whole life completely. And I think that sometimes that's sort of what you need. Like, I can go through the thick of it, I can go face the fears, I can go, face the dragon and see what comes out on the other side. And like you said, I think having an awareness of having an awareness that, who I am, like the core, what drives me, exists beyond this body, but it chose to come to this earth at this time. And I don't believe in consequences. I mean, consequences. I don't believe in coincidences.
Coincidences, right? Yeah, yeah.
Consequences exist, cause and effect, but coincidences I don't believe in.
Mm,
Um, and that has gotten me to ask, with the knowing, when we look at the truth of today, and we build our capacity to hold truth, it is guaranteed that within my lifetime, things are going to get worse before they get better.
mm,
And I need to go through the emotional process of accepting that. But when I look at that, I have to then ask myself, with the limited time that I have in this body at this moment, what is my life worth risking towards? And I think that asking myself that question and facing the fears, not just, it's important to, like, make a list and face the fears, but walking forward and seeing what fears come forward when
yeah.
you're walking this path.
Hmm.
Really, like, it's like as you step, the further you go, the more strength you acquire to keep going.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's like the biggest thing, is just for people to really sit with themselves. And I think that's what the pandemic really allowed me to do, because we weren't going anywhere.
Right.
Sit with myself and ask, what is my life worth risking towards? With no guarantee, there's no guarantee. But I know that at the end of my life, if I continue walking this path, I'll be very pleased with what I try to do out of love for
Mm,
life,
mm,
because it is in many ways, like, it's in our hands, but it's also out of our hands
mm,
at the same time, what
mm,
happens from the decisions that we choose today. So, yeah, there's a lot there around people connecting to the courage that they have within themselves, and that also honors the relationship. I'm really sitting in the space where I'm realizing my life is not just for me. And that's such a gift to have that knowing. Um, you know, so when I'm inspired to do something that my rational mind can't make sense of, or when I'm inspired to do something that will really make me stand apart from the norm, I have to trust that the reason is so much larger than me. And that also gives me the courage to sort of, you know, hold and move beyond, the parts of my own personal identity that's like, no, don't
mm,
stand out, But I feel like when you step into where you feel called and you stand apart, you realize you're not standing alone.
mm,
Even like conversations with you and hearing that you've been walking this journey your whole life. I mean, that also reminds me that we're not alone. And when I think about our ancestry, all of our ancestry, people who know how to live in this world harmoniously. Like they're with us, and so are the descendants of life. And so that gives me peace and
Mm,
courage to keep going.
beautiful. Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that's really important is that connection to you spoke about how um, what gave you the courage was feeling like there's this that life is not just for you, right? So that's also kind of a revelation in a way, right? And I think the more that we can create um, sort of grounds for the capacity to realize that for people is so important because it is emerging already. I mean, I find this a very interesting time because on one hand, there's so many terrible things that are happening. On the other side, there are there is an awareness that's developing, which is connected to the fact, I mean, as far as I see it anyway, particularly to the fact that people are starting to realize that we're part of the natural world, we're not separate from it. And I think that is kind of one of the avenues that we can begin to that can begin to awaken us to a completely different way of looking at what it means to be alive, which is so different from the one that we've been taught, where, we have to kind of almost like conquer life in a way. We have to, it's like a battle to conquer, to, survive as an individual. And but this connection to the natural, recognizing that we're not separate from the natural world, that we're part of nature, and particularly in these critical times, can awaken us to something where we feel, yeah, just like you described, that this is not about, it's not just about my life. There's something much bigger going on here of which I'm a part. And I think the way, the more we can create spaces for people to realize that, is one of the most important things that we can do right now, which is a very different direction than, say, it doesn't mean you have to, go out and do this or go out and do that. It has to do more with a kind of allowing oneself to, well, also part of it is connecting to ancestors, like you said, actually connecting, realizing that other people have done this. And those people have inspired the world, and learning about that, learning about the ways in which that has happened, that also gives us the courage to to experiment with life, to try things, to find ways of not just falling in with, what we're being told life is about, but actually recognizing that we're part of something much, much bigger than that, that is far beyond just ourselves. And it relates to the natural world, it relates to animals, it relates to our relationship with people, but it's looking at the whole thing from a very different perspective than the one that we've been trained to tell us that's important. This is a completely different thing, and that's the direction I think we really need. That, to me, that's what we need to find, develop resources and being able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it requires a lot of unlearning everything that we've been told and taught, and I guess inviting yourself to learn through experience, like to learn, like to, in some ways, and I think a lot about a lot of the great, wisdom and Sufism of just like this, like surrendering yourself to the experience of life, um, and letting life communicate to you what you need to know. In some ways, it's like, and also in Buddhism, again, just the shared relationality, the shared wisdom that just weaves through all of the different cultural traditions, religious traditions. Like my friend shares with me all the time, ehipasiko, which just means come and see for yourself. And I think that when we find the courage to let go of the illusion that we know everything there is to know, and that knowing everything there is to know is going to save us, we can drop fully into being, to learn from life, we have to be in relationship with life. Um, and again, that comes from externally, but it also comes internally with like really dropping into one and the same, we don't exist in a vacuum. We
Right,
just don't.
right, right.
Yeah. I'm curious for you, if you don't mind me asking. I've been having lots of conversations with um just different like elders about this moment because I myself and the next generation, the generations that are coming up, I mean, it seems like, I mean, I'm only 26 years old. And I feel like I've seen such rapid change just like in these 26 years. And it seems like, again, this is like the peak. But you have seen various cycles of change over your lifetime. And I'm always curious, what you would have to offer, from your experience of walking an internal and external journey, like what you would have to offer um, those of us who are emerging and trying to navigate, how to be.
Gosh, that's a big question. There's so many things. I mean, I think, just what we've been talking about is one of the biggest ones is that, I think the way in which this sort of the way in which everything has been set up for us to conform to life is one of the biggest issues. It's almost seems so hard now to believe that we can lead a different life to the one that we've been told is the really the only life that we can lead. So I, made, as I said, I made the choice at quite a young age that I was not going to live that life because I saw my siblings and people around me and who were growing up and starting to live that life, and I thought I don't want to live that kind of life because it just seems quite empty. And so I was quite determined from a young age to find a different way, and I think that decision itself is one of the biggest things that any individual can make. And you have to face a lot of fear when you make that kind of choice because you kind of that's what happens when you stand out, you go, and that's part of it. But uh I think it's the beginning really because it opens up so many doors to look at the world in a different way. Um, so I do think that that's one of the biggest things, and any ways that we can find the support to do that, to not feel that life has to look a certain way. I think that's a very important one, actually. And I think it's something that you've been expressing yourself in your own life. And I think, it's one of the most important lessons I feel it has been in my life is actually following that path. And of course it's quite an unknown path because you're treading waters that have not been, they're kind of you don't know where it's going to go, but you're trusting in something which is very deep. And I think that the more one is able to do that, you gain a greater strength inside. You feel the fear. You go past the fear, and when you go past the fear, then you feel more connected to life. You feel connected to life. You feel more care for life. You feel more concern for life, and you feel that you want your life to express that. So I think. To me, that's one of the most important things I would say. Because as you said earlier on, life actually is very diverse, and the diversity of life is an expression of nature itself. Nature is very diverse, and we've sort of funneled everything into this particular way of looking at life largely because of fear. It's kind of like and control, the sense that we have to control life, you know. And I think that's why we're in a position now where we have to face fear in order to step out of that, because we've got so used to living a life where we're trying to control everything and feeling like, well, that's the only way to live, because that's how we've been educated to believe that's what life is about. But I was very inspired myself by many individuals, particularly spiritual figures that have looked at life in a completely different way and understood also things like education in a completely different way. What does education really mean? What does it really mean to learn about life, to have the capacity to learn, to be open to life, to learn from everything that you experience from one moment of the day to the next, meeting somebody on the street, we can learn from everything if we actually have the courage to open ourselves to the experience of being alive and what that means. And then when we do that, we naturally feel connected to life and concerned about life because we don't see ourselves as separate from it. And so I think all of that comes from being willing to step out and to do what you would discuss. That's why I was very moved when you spoke about that at the beginning, because I think that um, we need to feel and be supported in that and find, I think, what happens is that you find out who your real friends are when you do that. because because some people have, it scares people if you step out. They go, oh God, I wouldn't do that. That's like not a good idea. So when you do step out, you don't feel, actually, you end up not feeling alone, but you connect to a whole different group of people that you find a communion with in a way that's just not possible when you're not willing to step out in that way, when you're too consumed by the fear of what would happen if you did. So I think to me that's one of the most important things that I've learned in my life is and been inspired by really by so many people who've been willing to do that in many different ways. Um, and I think, as we said earlier, I think leadership, we don't have many leaders in the world anymore who are being led by spirit, not by their own personal well, by living in the context of the way most people live, right? But living through spirit, and I think is that's what we desperately need. Is we need people that can lead us in that way, which is not about the ego. It's not about having to be somebody. It's about actually really recognizing that we're trying to do something together here, and it's very big. And we need to come together to do it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing and reflecting that. Because like you said, the communion, the sense of, all right, keep moving forward for all of us, who are on this path is to keep moving forward and trust.